Hello, my loves, my darlings, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds. Apologies for not much really going on over the Halloween period on the Exaggerated Elegy channel. I had such incredible plans, but as is the nature of such things, they went powerfully awry. The best laid plans of mice and men, and all that. As you can no doubt hear, I am still spluttering and sniffling and snorting after being struck down by some hideous plague. I sincerely hope that it's not the first symptoms of something like the T virus or something like that. That would be wonderful, wouldn't it? I don't think this would be much fun if I sort of degenerated into a sort of half-rotted zombie-like creature. That wouldn't be much fun at all. You wouldn't get much content out of it then, would you? Nevertheless, Halloween's been really invigorating, despite the colds and flus and viruses that have been shuffling about the place. It's been really invigorating, largely, as I said last time, because of the media that's been available, but because there's been what I love about Halloween is it brings a lot of people together in sincere celebration. My kind of people, basically, the people who have some sort of connection to disturbing or distressing material, to imagery that other people might ostensibly proclaim to find disturbing or upsetting or whatnot. I was actually having a conversation with I suppose a lady who is just simply not of that tribe. She is not of that particular ilk. About how inspiring and beautiful I was finding some of the material out there. I was specifically talking to her about things like The Haunting of Hill House and how visually beautiful some of the shots are. And she found it very difficult to accept. She found it very difficult to take that something can be horrific and beautiful at the same time. I find that interesting. I do find that interesting because in my mind, and I clearly in a lot of other people's minds as well, notions of beauty, of aesthetic beauty, are bound up with things that are also evoke sensations of distress and disturbia. I mean, you've got entire artistic movements that are based on that very principle. I mean, the Surrealist movement technically is based on that very principle. The core emphasis of the Surrealist movement was simply throwing together images that have no business being together, that sort of thematically contrast or contradict one another, and therefore evoke sensations of not necessarily disturbance, but certainly of being unsettled, of being shunted outside of one's comfort zone, of one's normal state of mind. And that is exactly what disturbing material does. It's what horrific material does at its most ideal and essential. But as we've talked about on this show before, very often in popular mainstream horror media, what you tend to find is that imagery that's marketed as being horrific and disturbing and unsettling is not. It's the slasher film stuff, it's stuff that conforms to formula. So rather than being disturbing or unsettling, rather than shunting us into other states of mind and emotion, it actually does the opposite. It reinforces us, even though we might react as though it doesn't, even though, because we're conditioned to, even though we might jump at the right moment or go, at the right moment, it's actually reinforcing us. And that is not horror. That's not horror. That's not what horror is at its most essential. That is something that is codified and something that is reinforcing us in very particular ways. The same is true of any material that reinforces certain, cultural and traditional norms rather than throwing them into question. I mean, there are multiple different types of horror that do different things. I mean, a lot of traditional horror derives from reinforcing certain cultural status quos. It's the fairy tale stuff. It's the stuff of don't stray from the path, don't go into the darkened woods, don't talk to strangers. Excuse me. There you are. There's the plague. Yes, it's that kind of stuff that reinforces cultural norms. That is a very particular form of horror, a very traditional form of horror. It's what John Carpenter calls right-wing horror. But for my money, ideally, horror doesn't do that. In the same way that science fiction doesn't ideally do that. For my money, the best type of horror, the most idealized type of horror, does exactly the opposite. Rather than reinforcing cultural norms, it calls them into question. Rather than reinforcing moral norms, it calls them into question. It shunts us outside of what is comfortable. Some of the very best art, like disturbing art I can think of, like for example, H.R. Giger's artwork, does exactly that. H.R. Giger's artwork has this wonderful capacity for upsetting every preconception we have of how things go together. In his artwork, you will find mechanisms married to anatomy, married to organs, married to flesh, married to sometimes architecture even, which is then married to geography, to landscapes. It's very strange, very disturbing. And in the very best work, which is often to be found in the Necronomicon, which is one of H.R. Giger's most famous books and rather difficult to get a hold of these days, you even find notions of dimension being upset. So the states of being that he records, where these strange biomechanoid, pseudo-occult, angelic, demonic creatures operate, is antithetical to what we would consider normal dimension. It seems to be twisted and transformed and altered, and it doesn't seem to sit quite right. All of the dimensions are distorted and weird. Things that should be in the foreground bleed into the background, and so on and so forth. It's very cool. It's very beautiful. If I'm lacking for inspiration, or if I'm finding myself feeling a bit down in the doldrums or not able to write or whatnot, one of the things I do is go and look at artwork. As well as listening to music, one of the other things I do is go and look at artwork. I've got books of artwork from Dali, from Surrealists, from Goya, Blake. Blake is one of my favourite artists in all the world, as well as one of my favourite poets. From Clive Barker, from H.R. Giger, all sorts of stuff littering my bookshelves over there. And I usually find an image, something that doesn't necessarily spark something specific. It doesn't plant the seed of a story, but it invigorates somehow. It sparks that right connection that puts me in the frame of mind I need to be to work, which is fantastic. I mean, often it is something aesthetic, it is something visual. And I'm a very visual writer anyways. Anyone who's read my short stories and whatnot, yes, all 12 of you out there, any of you who have read them will know I'm a very, very, very aesthetic writer. I like imagery. I like very vivid, very sort of textured images and symbols and situations. It's what I'm attracted to. It's what I'm really attracted to. That and sensation. I really like sensation in writing and in storytelling. But yeah, she was finding it difficult to comprehend how something can be simultaneously disturbing and beautiful. And I don't think it's possible to explain in words. I think it is actually a point at which words fail, to be perfectly honest, which is a very odd thing for someone who works primarily with language to admit, but I think it's true. What I think is that there are divergences in influence and development here. At some point, somewhere in my development, in fact, in multiple points, I've no doubt, that which is beautiful, that which inspires, has become bound up with that which also evokes sensations of disturbance and horror and dread and grotesquerie. That is clearly not true of her. That is clearly not true of her. And I think it's a point where our tribes just diverge, and that's the end of it. We just have to agree to disagree and move on, because otherwise it will always become a matter of imposition, I'm afraid. It will always become a matter of impositions of taste, which I'm not interested in. What I would never say to anyone is that they should be inspired by what I'm inspired by. In the same way I would not take that from anyone else, you know? I find there is this awful tendency certainly in popular fiction, popular literature, for sociocultural tracts to be the norm, and I find them to be largely banal. I find them to be largely banal, and without much merit. Now, that's not to say that they are without merit to other people, or that other people would not be stirred by them in ways that I am not, and the same is true of the material that I consume. But it's interesting, there is a genuine tribal divergence there. And I imagine that the tribe that I sort of identify with in that regard, even though it's a very loose knit one, it's like a tribe of cats, is smaller. I imagine it's much smaller. I imagine it has much less in the way of socio-cultural influence. And that is very clear because when you look at horror, and subjects that are related to it, which are generally lumped under the heading of speculative fiction these days, you tend to find that it is rather disregarded, certainly in academic circles, certainly in terms of mainstream criticism. It tends to be disregarded as somehow immature, as somehow an underdeveloped genre, or a genre that does not have any kind of wider political, philosophical, or ideological merit. And of course that's absurd. That's absolutely absurd when you... But it's interesting, there is a genuine tribal divergence there. And I imagine that the tribe that I sort of identify with in that regard, even though it's a very loose-knit one, it's like a tribe of cats, is smaller. I imagine it's much smaller. I imagine it has much less in the way of socio-cultural influence. And that is very clear because when you look at horror, and subjects that are related to it, which are generally lumped under the heading of speculative fiction these days, you tend to find that it is rather disregarded, certainly in academic circles, certainly in terms of mainstream criticism. It tends to be disregarded as somehow immature, as somehow an underdeveloped genre, or a genre that does not have any kind of wider political, philosophical, or ideological merit. And of course that's absurd. That's absolutely absurd when you start to look at the history of fiction itself, certainly in this country, but just more widely. Horrific material has been used since the days of ancient mythology. The very, very earliest incarnations of the stories that we endlessly retell to one another and to ourselves contain some of the most surreal, bizarre, disturbing imagery imaginable. Go and read go and read a translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Go and read up about the mythologies of Apsu and Tiamat, the oldest gods that we know of. Go and look at the ancient Sumerian and Mesopotamian mythologies that the later monotheistic traditions like Christianity and Judaism and Islam derive from. You will find some of the weirdest, most surreal, violent, bizarre shit in those stories. And these are stories around which the original societies and civilizations were organized. So, yeah. And the same is true, of course, when you go and read things like the Talmud or the Bible or the Quran. Absolutely full of... I mean, have you ever read Revelations? The last book of the Bible, Revelations? It's a trip. It's my favorite book of the Bible, and it's an absolute trip. It's so bizarre. It's so weird. The imagery is just out there. It's very easy to see where William Blake... excuse me. It's very easy to see where William Blake derived his visions from. For that matter, go and read Blake. Go and read Blake's poetry. Go and look at the images. It's very easy to see where William Blake derived his visions from. For that matter, go and read Blake. Go and read Blake's poetry. Go and look at the images that he created. They are surreal. They are bizarre. They are disturbing. And yet, those that would condemn, say, postmodern horror, the works of, say, Clive Barker or of Stephen King or of Richard Matheson or whatever, or of, indeed, of Harlan Ellison, or those that sort of stray over into other genres like science fiction, would not in the same breath condemn Shelley or Blake or even Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde wrote some wampy, weird, brilliant, horrific material. Go and read Salome. Go and read The Picture of Dorian Gray. These are iconic texts within the canon of British literature, not just horror fiction, but all fiction. It's bizarre to me that an entire genre can be so easily disregarded on an academic and popular level. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of criticisms that are aimed collectively at horror as it operates on a popular level are true. There's a lot of shit. There's a lot of derivative formulaic bullshit out there. And that is largely as a result of market forces more than anything. Things like in the aftermath of The Walking Dead, zombie apocalypse stories are 10 a penny, and most of them are bollocks. Most of them are all the same. Not all of them. There's some good stuff out there, but most of them are bollocks. In the aftermath of Twilight, sort of tweeny vampire romance became vogue. There will be something else. I imagine in the aftermath of maybe Sabrina, The Chilling Tales of Sabrina on Netflix, or The Haunting of Hill House, witch and haunted house stories respectively might become vogue again. It is the nature of this genre, unfortunately. And to get the best stuff, you often need to dig down. You need to dig down deep, and you need to do a bit of work. You need to look at the independent markets very often, because although again there's a lot of shit out there, there's such wonderful and interesting stuff happening on the independent market. I mean, I happen to operate there, and although again there's a lot of crap, there's so much good stuff too. There's so many voices that you wouldn't otherwise hear that, quite frankly, a lot of them are better than the gatekeepers of the genre, those who are sort of canonized and enshrined, your Clive Barkers and your Stephen Kings and whatnot. There are better writers in operating in the independent and small press markets. There just absolutely are on a technical level. But because of the nature of the genre, the nature of markets as they currently stand, it's very difficult for those voices to be heard. Especially since there's something about horror in particular whereby very often the best stuff is the most niche stuff. It's the most disregarded. Because the experience of reading and consuming good horror is not pleasant. That's the most interesting thing about it. It's actually not a pleasant experience, because the best stuff is genuinely distressing. It's genuinely disturbing. It's an acquired taste. In order to appreciate genuinely horrific material, genuinely disturbing material, you need to cultivate the taste for it. You need to be able to appreciate trauma. You need to be able to appreciate being upset by something. And that's very, very difficult, particularly in the cultural status quos in which we operate, where comfort and conciliation are marketed as though they are the highest ideals, as though they're things that you should aspire to. I mean, I don't watch television myself. I just don't watch it. My big TV here is not hooked up to anything apart from my PS4. It doesn't have anything on it other than that. If I want to watch a TV series or whatever, then I will purchase it and stream it or something like that, but I don't watch television itself. The only time I'm around a television that's on is when I'm at other people's homes. And because of that distance, what I tend to find is that I am appalled, and I mean regularly and obscenely appalled by how the media talks to its audience. From adverts that use fear tactics, that treat their audiences as though they're fucking imbeciles, to daytime talk shows and reality shows that market themselves as though they've got something to say, as though they are somehow reflective of reality when they're not. It is just banal, empty, weary, soundbite, vox populi bullshit. The way the medium condescends its audience is unbelievable to me. It actually shocks me. It actually shocks me a lot of the time because I'm so divorced from it. And what bothers me is how normalized it has become. And people are not disturbed by that. They're not distressed by that. But they will be distressed or disturbed if you show them something that they're conditioned to react to with distress or disturbance. So something that is called horror, that is marketed as horror. That they find, but which is entirely fictional. Entirely fictional. They won't be, they'll be disturbed by that. They'll raise the roof about that very often. But when something talks to them like absolute shit, when something you know, it's like bank adverts or car adverts that often utilize really beautiful imagery to sell you something, to do something, to just, it's like to sell you a lifestyle, to sell you plastic. I find that more disturbing than anything. I find that really distressing. I find banality offensive. I really do. I find banality and the marketing of banality as though it's something you should aspire to as offensive. And I imagine that's what... I don't know whether that's why I'm attracted to horror, or whether the influence of horror is why I feel that way. If you see what I mean. It's a chicken and egg argument. I just don't know, because I can't take my own mind, set it aside, and look at the influences that have acted upon its shape and say, yes, that's why I feel this way, because I can't have objectivity on it, because it's my mind. It's the mind assessing the mind. It's a paradox. It can't be done. But I would conjecture that there is an interrelation there. There's a very complex interrelation there. Whereas for me, material that others would regard as disturbing, I find to be reinforcing very often. It does evoke sensations of disturbance, but they're pleasant. I've conditioned myself to find it pleasant somehow, and to react almost positively to it, and that's really fascinating to me. It's endlessly fascinating to me, and I imagine it's sort of a mystery that is self-mythologizing, that a lot of people who enjoy horror for one reason or another also feel. I imagine it's something we all feel. We have learned to take that darkness, that psychological darkness, and to find it luscious. We find it almost luxuriant. It's like a big decadent dessert. It's wonderful. And when I come across something that does that affects me that way, then I can't get enough of it. I really can't. When a story or a TV program or a movie shocks me, or actually genuinely leaves me feeling unsettled in myself because it brings something into question, that I love. I can't get enough of that. It's rare, though. It's very rare. There is a film out there at the moment doing the rounds, Possum, film by Matthew Holness, who is, a lot of you will know from Garth Marenghi's Dark Place. He's the writer of Garth Marenghi's Dark Place, and the guy who plays Garth Marenghi as well, which is a parody of horror, of the horror genre, and of horror writers and horror TV and cinema. It's absolutely brilliant. But it's clear that the reason the parody is so sharp in Garth Marenghi's Dark Place is because he knows the genre inside out. It's because he's a fan. He's obviously a fan. And the trailer for Possum, which you need to go and watch, by the way, I just go and watch it, has me so excited. It has me so excited because it looks disturbing. It actually looks distressing. It looks like one of those films that will leave you feeling soiled for having watched it, and I love that feeling. It's rare as hen's teeth. You know that feeling of having watched something forbidden? That's what I want. I got it from The Witch very recently. I didn't get it from Hereditary, which surprised me, because a lot of people were really crying the praises of Hereditary. I didn't quite get the same reaction. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a decent, very, very, very well done film for the most part. But I did not get the same sense of distress from Hereditary as I got from The Witch, it's produced by the same people. What I got from The Witch was this very uncomfortable sense of being present when I shouldn't be. as though I'm spying on this family slowly going insane together. It's a horrible, horrible thing, and absolutely brilliant at the same time. It's wonderful, a wonderful sensation for a film to evoke. The Thing does it. The Thing has that same feeling for me, that sort of dirty, grimy feeling, as does the first two Hellraiser films. They both have that slightly forbidden feeling about them, as though you've somehow been tainted by watching them. I love that. It's rarer still for a book to do it. I've got to say, it's rarer still for a short story to do it. I was rereading recently a collection that was compiled by Billy Martin, Poppy Z. Brite as was, called it's one of the Love in Vain books. It's the second one, which is called is it called Tapping the Vein or something like that? I can't quite remember, but it's the second volume. And Love in Vain it's a collection of 2 volumes that are erotic vampire tales, and this is a long time before Twilight. These were compiled, I think, in the early to mid 1990s, so long time before Twilight. And they're beautiful. I mean, the stories in these books are fantastic, but there are some of the stories in those that left me feeling this way, because they're total. What I love about these collections is they're not only unabashedly erotic and violent and depraved and wonderful, they're also amoral. They are totally without morality, and I love that. I love that in horror. I love horror that does not pull its punches, that does not judge its characters. It just lets them be as they are, as they would be, as they would operate. It's why I like the work of Patrick Suskind. He often does that. In books like Perfume, for example, the story of a murderer. There's no judgment in Perfume, not for although all the characters are pretty much vile. There's no real judgment as such. They just operate as they do. That's the end of it. But I got that same sensation, I got that same feeling. I get it from reading The Books of Blood by Barker. I get it from reading some of the stories in Neil Gaiman's collections, like Fragile Things or Smoke and Mirrors. It's that sense that somehow by reading the story, you're almost incanting a spell to yourself. You're opening the way for something malign and something corrupting. And that's wonderful. I love that. I love that feeling. It's just rare. It's just terribly rare. But yeah, speaking of Billy Martin, Billy's work is some of my favourites, in not only in horror but in all of literature. And Billy's work does transcend that genre. It's the kind of work that is often labelled as horror but isn't really. It's just because it happens to include imagery and material and subject matter that coincides with horror. Very often what you find in Billy's work is that it's these twisted love stories, these erotic fables married to the violence and the viscera and the ambiguity of horror. Things like, for example, Lost Souls, which is one of the vampire romance stories. It's absolutely stunning. My favourite one of all, which is Exquisite Corpse, which I believe I've discussed before on this show. Exquisite Corpse is one of my favourite books ever written. But the reason it's so disturbing is because it makes you not only identify with the worst people in the world, 2 serial killers, like psychopaths, it also makes them attractive, and that's a really tricky thing to deal with as a reader. It's wonderful, absolutely wonderful, but yeah, it does make them attractive. But speaking of Billy's work, one of the things that's going on out there in the horror genre at the moment, and which is going to be quite big early next year, is we are going to make January a sort of themed month where websites like the Ginger Nuts of Horror, which I write for, and lots of independent writers are getting involved, and it's going to be a sort of LGBTQ month in horror. So we're going to be taking a look at, through various articles and works and stories and whatnot, we're going to be taking a look at how horror, the themes of horror and the subjects of horror intermesh with the themes that are generally regarded as also LGBTQ. We're going to be looking at outside voices in the horror genre, voices that are not necessarily standard. And I think that's going to be amazing. I think that's going to be really fun because there are many of us. There are many of us. I mean, I identify as gay, and my work often is very different from what you'd expect to find in more standard horror fiction. It just is. It's just very, very different, for better or worse. That's just the way it is. So, yeah, we're going to be doing that, and that's going to be really fun. I think it's going to be very, very interesting. It's difficult to do. It's difficult to do without being reductive, without being too narrow and prescribed. That is what I'm certainly going to be trying to avoid in this one. I don't want, although obviously politics and socio-cultural tracts are part of this, I don't want it to become exclusively that. I would like it to explore deeper than that myself. But yeah, look out for that. That is going to be really fascinating. And there are going to be a number of Strange Playgrounds episodes devoted exclusively to that. Beyond that, there is some news in that the Born in Blood project, which is a project that I and my friend Nick Hardy, the photographer, have been working on, is speeding ahead at the moment. Nick has 3 of the visual volumes published out there, and you can find links to them below. The visual volumes are really cool. They are these wonderful volumes of Nick's photographs and extracts of my short stories, and all of the money from those goes to mental health charities. So that's really cool. And there are also going to be 2 short story collections, 2 full short story collections from Perpetual Motion Machine Publishing, which I've written, and they're going to be published very soon. And believe me, I hope you enjoy them. I really do, because I had to bleed for them. I really did. They took me to some very dark places, the Born in Blood books. They really, really did. To the point whereby at one point in the project I had to stop it. I had to stop writing because it was actually taking me to some very, very unwanted dark places. It was bringing up associations that I didn't necessarily want to be brought up. So yeah, there's going to be that. So the links to those below. So yeah, there's loads going on. It's all very, very busy at the moment. All very busy. Look out for next January, when we'll be doing the LGBTQ in Horror Month, and that's going to be as I say, it's going to be fun. It's going to be fun trying to work it out from the inside, I suppose. Trying to look into how my love of horror relates to the fact that I'm gay, and how those two things express one another. And what I sincerely hope is to get other people involved as well. If you would like to be involved somehow, let me know. Leave a comment, send me a message, come and have a look at the Facebook or something like that. Come and have a look at my Twitter at Enigmatic Elegy, and we'll see what we can put together. Until then, I'm going to stop jabbering now, because I don't even know what I've been jabbering about for the past half hour. I sincerely hope to hear from you all very soon. Until then, bye-bye! together. Until then, I'm going to stop jabbering now because I don't even know what I've been jabbering about for the past half hour. I sincerely hope to hear from you all very soon. Until then, bye-bye!